Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's a great pleasure and great honor for me to introduce you Professor Immanuel Wallerstein in Turkish and Wallerstein or Wallerstein in American.
Same person, though.
Same person. 10 years ago, when I was translating geopolitics and geoculture, I went to Binghamton to visit Professor Wallerstein. He was not in his office. I asked nearby professors that I'm looking for Professor Wallerstein. They said, such a person does not exist. We know Professor Wallerstein, but he's not here. Actually, he was at Brodel Center at the other building. We could not meet. It is my pleasure that now we meet together. He is a great scholar who combined social science or science in general with politics, who sees the two things as the same venture. And I think this night we are wondering about his personal venture, or in some sense adventure, in this journey, in this his lifelong venture in scholarship. We have a very general topic, and the chair is yours. Please, Professor.
Well, should we talk into this or into that? Doesn't matter.
No.
I didn't come prepared to make a speech. I thought we were going to have a discussion, but let me say a few words about my venture or adventure. It starts quite some time ago, 50 years ago or so. As a student, I was actually very interested in American politics, and I, in fact, wrote my master's thesis on McCarthyism and the conservative. But I was also interested in what was not yet called the Third World. And I had been active in youth organizations, and I had gone to an international youth congress that took place in Africa in 1952. That's quite a while ago. Very early for interest in Africa, but I got then fascinated with Africa, and I decided to do my doctoral dissertation on an African topic, and that started my career as an Africanist, which I was for 15 years or so. Wrote quite a bit of a number of books and articles on contemporary Africa. But at one point I decided that I was running after headlines, that everything was changing in a post-independence Africa, and I was always explaining what had happened in the last 6 months, and I decided that really wasn't the proper role of a scholar. I had to understand it in more historical depth, and that led me. I made I had a foolish idea which turned out to be very useful. My foolish idea was that at that time everyone was describing the new states in Africa and indeed in Asia as well as new nations. So I said to myself, if these are new nations, there must be old nations. And maybe I should learn what happened to old nations in order to figure out what happens to new nations. So I decided that old nations really meant England and France and perhaps Spain in the 16th century. And so I went back to look at what was going on in these countries at that period of time, and of course that's a crazy idea to explain what's going on in West Africa in the 20th century. But that got me into the 16th century, you see. And at that's the beginning of my shift from being a student of Africa to being a student of the modern world system, because out of that comes the book that I write, The Modern World System, Volume 1, which I wrote in 1970, and which was all about the 16th century. And that started me on a lifetime of writing a book which is not yet completed, because only 3 volumes have appeared, and I'm working on the 4th, and there ought to be a 5th and maybe a 6th. Who knows? I've given up counting, and that's been my, if you want, my central activity. I've been trying to explain the historical development of the modern world system, which is a capitalist world economy, how it functions, how it developed over time, and why I think it's in structural crisis these days. So in one sense, I am working on the historical development of the modern world system, but I can't stay away from the present crisis in the world system, so I write a lot about the present and the near future and the structural crisis. And then this got me into a third area. I found that I not only had to defend my views of how to understand the modern world system and see it as a world system, which was very important to me, but I had to defend the epistemology I was using, that it came under great criticism, at least in the United States. And so I got into various epistemological issues, which, well, one of there are a number of products of that. There's Unthinking Social Science, which I believe, as I recall, has been translated into Turkish, and there's The Uncertainties of Knowledge, a new book this year, which is coming out in Turkish. But most importantly, perhaps, there's the Gulbenkian Commission's Open the Social Sciences, and that I know is in Turkish. That was an attempt to look at the historical development of the social sciences in general and the problems which collectively it faces in the last 20, 30 years. And that got me into another broader issue of the emergence of the concept of the two cultures and the so-called divorce between philosophy and science, which turns out to be a very recent divorce, only in the middle of the 18th century, and it's finally coming under serious challenge again today. So in fact, I have another book coming out, which is part of the project of the Fernand Braudel Center, called Overcoming the Two Cultures, Science versus the Humanities in the Modern World System. That's a book written with other people, and that will be out in English in another month or so. So this is the summary, in the sense I start with this interest in American politics, which gets me into the interest in the Third World and its centrality of the North-South struggle in the post-Second World War era, and indeed for longer. That gets me into Africa. From Africa, I have to move, in order to understand contemporary Africa, I have to understand the whole development of the modern world system, and that gets me into this exercise in historical sociology, if you want, and then that gets me into coming back to what's going on right now, because I see the modern world system as being in a structural crisis, and one has to talk about that and write about that and speak about that. And then finally, as I say, the criticisms of others got me into the epistemological questions, and once into that, I saw the concept of the two cultures as one of the products of the modern world system, and the challenge to the concept of the two cultures as being part of the crisis of the modern world system which we're living in now. And then finally, this little book, which just came out and which will be in Turkish too fairly soon, I hope, is my attempt to write a 100-page serious introduction to what I call world systems analysis, which is my, how shall I say, my mode of understanding the modern world, its historical development, its current crisis, its epistemological problems, etc., etc., etc. So this book was written for university students, but also for the general public. It's trying to write for both audiences at once, and everybody here must be in one or the other audience. So, I see it got to Turkey very fast since it only came out a month ago in the United States. I'm quite impressed that Mr. Özel has a copy already in his possession. So that's my general introduction. Now I think I should allow myself to answer questions that people might have, that you might have, or that people out there might have.
Well, first, questions from the floor.
This is a question that I was curious during my conversation with the Japanese historians of Japan's economic history. I lived in Japan for 2 years, and while I was talking to some of the leading scholars of Japanese economic history, like Nakamura Masanori, they told me that I was very surprised. They were all socialists and Marxists. They said, look, from the very beginning, we read Wallerstein, the war system, but we couldn't apply it to Japan, and we couldn't use it. And
In Japan?
In Japan.
Yeah.
And of course, the person I was talking to, he was the person.
Who were you talking to?
Nakamura Masanori.
Nakamura
Masanori, who wrote the book.
Masanori.
Who wrote the book Peasants and Workers. He was some sort of a leading authority who wrote the classical work on Japanese peasants and workers in the 19th and 20th century, their culture and how they created the modern Japan. And he was saying that for somehow, those Japanese socialists and Marxists who applied your theory couldn't really explain what happened in Japan. And thus, out of all of his respect with you, he had to come up with totally a different one. And his idea was that Japanese kind of squeezed the Japanese peasants and workers to create the capital and then build this modern economy without owing any debt to the outsiders. And I was thinking, in Turkey, there was a very strong trend to use your model, but they weren't very good in archival research. And he was saying that those people who are good in archival research, they couldn't use your thesis. How would you see your thesis kind of applied in different areas like Japan and Turkey?
Well,
what kind of feedback did you get to revise via China? And what kind of feedback kind of led you to revise your thesis? I was just curious.
Well, I think Japan and Turkey have different answers. The fact is that in the framework of my analysis, Japan and China are the last areas to be incorporated into the capitalist world economy, and they're only incorporated in the late 19th century. So that in fact, my first 3 volumes don't deal with them. That will come out in volume 4, which hasn't appeared yet. So I haven't applied it, if you will, to Japan. Now, Japanese economic historians, I've had a lot of contact with them over the years. They have various approaches. Basically, there is what I would call a very strong nationalist school, which wants to insist that Japan and Western Europe were on parallel paths. That Japan comes to modern capitalism over here, Western Europe comes to modern capitalism over there, and want to start the story. It depends on which historian we're talking about, but a lot of them want to start the story in the Tokugawa period, and then somehow these two capitalism's meat in the mid-19th century? Well, you know, that's a variant of what was what still is standard economic history in most of the Western world, which wants to see France, Britain, Germany, the United States, and anybody else as sort of coming to capitalism separately. And this is just, you know, the nation state as the unit of analysis. This is the England first hypothesis, which others at later stages copy or something. And well, my whole intellectual thrust is to say this is a completely wrong image of the world, and that's not what happened historically, and I don't think that's what happened in Japan. But I haven't argued this case. Now, in the case of Turkey or the Ottoman Empire, I have tried to argue the case both in a few articles, but basically in Volume 3 of the Modern World System, where I say the Ottoman Empire is one of 4 major regions that are pulled into the capitalist world economy somewhere between about 1750 and 1850, and the structurally parallel processes go on. My regions are Russia and India and the Ottoman Empire and West Africa, all of which get pulled in this period of time as the system expands, and that you can explain, I think, what happened in the Ottoman Empire between 1750 and 1850 and as a process of incorporation into the capitalist world economy, which had certain impact on the state structures and on the economic structures and so forth. And after about 1850, it's you know, it's a fairly peripheral region within the world economy, which faces the problems that other peripheral regions face, and to some extent Turkey, which is the historical successor, if you will, because the Ottoman Empire breaks up, basically, is broken up, if you will, is still trying to overcome. I mean, but then Turkey is not different from Brazil or Korea or, you know, 35 other places which are all faced with the same dilemmas of, quote, development, unquote. That's how it's termed. I don't find it difficult to, that doesn't mean I've convinced everyone, but I don't find it difficult to place any area. I see the capitalist world system, the world economy, as a singular occurrence. It was created in the long 16th century in a part of the world. It's the first time, well, it's not the first time that people tried to create a system like that, but it's the first time that it consolidated itself and in which the endless accumulation of capital became the driving principle. But it only did it in a part of the world, and part of its internal dynamic was its need over time to expand geographically, which it does, but bit by bit, because it can't, because people resist, and because it can't absorb more than a certain amount at a certain time, and it doesn't manage to become worldwide until the late 19th century. I don't think capitalism was invented 25 times. I think it was invented, so to speak, once. And since then, it's been a self-propelling structure, and it's now a worldwide phenomenon, and its geography is the entire world, and its crisis is in the entire world. So, you know, resistance to this idea is partly intellectual, but there is an element of nationalism in it. And Japanese scholars do have different visions of the exact process, but I agree that most of them are not fully convinced that I have explained Japan. But as I say, in the case of Japan, they haven't read anything of me on Japan because I haven't written anything on Japan yet. They'll have to wait and deal with what I have to say when I have to say it.
Thank you, Professor. But I think there is another non-nationalist Japanese strand who are closely associated with world system analysis, like Takeshi Yamashita. They argue for region-oriented world economies.
Well, Yamashita is he's ambivalent. He's attracted by world systems analysis. He's not completely convinced. He has his basic argument is that from circa 1500, from the beginning of the Ming Dynasty, or rather the end of the Ming Dynasty, to today, there has been an East Asian region which China dominated. It's a sort of China's expansion, not merely culturally but economically, not only into Northeast Asia but into Southeast Asia, and that there's been a sort of continuity of that phenomenon, and you can't really understand what's going on in East Asia without seeing the centrality of China and Chinese economic, shall I say, tentacles over all that period. So when I come along and say, well, in the second half of the 19th century, China and Japan are pulled in to something I call the capitalist world economy, he doesn't disagree, but he wants to argue nonetheless there's this kind of regional continuity which is playing an important role, is part of the explanation. And I suppose, I'm not sure he's wrong. That is to say, if one wants to understand China's ability in the late 20th century to expand its economy in significant ways, these historic ties that it has to the region and the overseas Chinese do play an important part of the explanation. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how I'm going to deal with this yet. But I don't find, I'm not at odds with Yamashita the way I'm at odds with, and of course Yamashita is Japanese, but he is a historian of China. And that makes him different from these other Japanese who are historians of Japan. And he has a really Sinocentric view, which is unusual for a Japanese scholar. I mean, he really sees the world through Chinese eyes rather than through Japanese eyes. But that may be a healthy thing. It lops off some of the nationalism.
Okay. Other questions? But I think there are Chinese or Japanese nationalists in America as well, in California, for example.
Oh, yes.
Those who argue that the great divergence started late in the 19th century.
Well, the so-called California school. But look, they want to, how shall I say, demonstrate that in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries, the divergence between what was going on in China and what was going on in Western Europe was not all that great. Now, there are two things to say about that. One is, I think, they don't like to talk very much, these people, about capitalism.
And they don't like the word capitalism.
They don't like the concept, really. And so when I say to them what was going on in this Western European-dominated world was the creation of a capitalist world economy, they just want to see it as a sort of an economy, not a capitalist economy, and therefore what was going on in China was basically similar. And then they really have no explanation, given that assumption, of what happened in the 19th century. If it was basically similar, why did the West simply, in a sense, take over and dominate China and Japan in the mid and late 19th century? And they all sort of admit, when you press them on it, that they don't have a good explanation of that. They want to get to an explanation. Of course, the exaggerated version of this is Gunter Frank's Reorient, where he wants to say, well, you know, China's been the center of the world for 5,000 years. It was the center of the world up to the 18th century. Somehow that suddenly disappeared, but that's a sort of momentary blip, and it's now again the center of the world, or will be very shortly. But as I say, what is central to my analysis is the explanation of a phenomenon which is not true of all of history, which is the dominance of something called capitalism. And I want to explain how it came into existence and how it functions. And the minute you do that, you don't end up with the hypotheses of the California School or of those Japanese economic historians to which you were referring. And so much of the detail of a book, well, like the book by Pomerantz, so well, much of the detail is absolutely correct. I wouldn't argue about it, but the how should I say, pulling all the pieces together, I think he does it in an incorrect way. Again, there is a bit of nationalism in that they are trying to respond as historians of China, to a kind of historic depreciation of China in Western literature. And they're really, like nationalists everywhere, are saying, well, we really were wonderful always, and they want to demonstrate that in some way. And I'm all for overcoming Eurocentrism, but I don't think you overcome Eurocentrism by inventing Sinocentrism. I mean, that it's just, it's not the answer to what is a real intellectual problem, which is Eurocentrism. But, I wrote an article on that. Yeah, the Eurocentrism and its avatars, which appeared in the New Left Review and was it was incorporated into the end of the world as we know it? No. After liberalism, yes, okay. So you can take a look at my arguments about Eurocentrism.
Other questions?
Yeah, somebody.
Yeah, Misha.
Wait, he's coming with the microphone.
Biraz bekle. Şunu geçsin.
About the current crisis of capitalism that you mentioned, is it a crisis of the capitalism, that singular historic event of capitalism, or some kind of capitalism as is? In that respect, what are the technological changes, especially in information technology, affect the structure of the Eurocentric world, globalization, with respect to, the world system analysis? Well,
from my point of view, there aren't capitalisms, there's only capitalism. So there can't be different kinds of capitalism. There can be different state policies vis-a-vis, some are more oriented to social welfare and some less, and so forth. This is a state policy of manipulating what the state can do in terms of its interests within the framework of a capitalist world economy, but they're not different forms of capitalism. There's only one form of capitalism. So if I say there's a crisis of capitalism, I mean of capitalism as a system. And I've argued this in a number of places. The best place to look at that is probably utopistics, which also exists in Turkish, and where I argue that capitalism is in crisis not because of its failures, but because of its successes, that it has exhausted various possibilities of keeping costs under control, that there's consequently a crisis of the ability to accumulate capital, which structurally they can't overcome, and that therefore the system is moved far from equilibrium, and we're in a chaotic situation. I think if you look around the world today, it is a fairly chaotic situation, both politically and economically, and that we are living in what I call the age of transition, which will take 25 to 50 years, and out of which we will, at the end of which we will find ourselves in some other system, but we don't know what, because it's inherently unpredictable, and that's what the big political struggle is about today. So, yes, it's a structural crisis of the singular capitalist system that I am arguing. Of course, within the framework of the capitalist system, the things are going on. So the United States is declining, and that's changing many things. But that's within the framework of the existing capitalist system. That isn't the explanation of the structural crisis. That's parallel to previous declines of hegemonic powers.
Thanks.
What about the new age, as quoted about the information technology?
Yeah, that's rhetoric for me, okay? First of all, technology never explains anything. Not now, not previously, and so forth. Technology is a consequence, not a cause. One of the things about capitalism as a system is it rewards technological advance. And therefore it's had much faster and more important technological advances than any other kind of system. That's not the cause of that's the consequence of having a capitalist system. Information technology is merely the latest variant on one of the two major areas of technological advance. Well, three. There are three major areas of technological advance over the last 500 years. It's in the use of energy, it's in the speed and costs of transportation, and the speed and costs of communication. Those are the three areas in which everything's been improving for 500 years. So, yes, we've improved the speed and efficiency of communication enormously. That's what you're calling information technology in the last 20 or 30 years. But that's not really different from introducing the telegraph 150 years ago in terms of consequence. Indeed, the telegraph is very interesting because if you people have gone back and looked at kind of what the scholars and the press said about the telegraph at the time that it became, and if you closed your eyes and didn't read the text and you substituted the word internet for telegraph, you'd find out that everything they say about the internet they said about the telegraph. And it was all true, but it didn't transform the system as such. And the internet is not transforming the system, but it's true. It's faster. So, but so is our. It took 2 years to go back and forth in ships from Western Europe to India in the 16th century. And now it takes, 12 hours by airplane and so forth. So that makes a difference. But it doesn't make a structural difference. It just means it's all faster. But it's faster for everybody.
Başka soru yok mu?
Is it possible to resist capitalism or to be able to have a system in this world at that moment of time, not against, but to be able to live with capitalism?
It depends what you mean by that. Do you mean, can Turkey opt out of the capitalist world system in some sense? No. can't opt out. Nobody can opt out. Some people tried it, but they didn't succeed. Impossible. Can you resist? Of course. Resistance goes on all over the place. It's been going on for a long, long time. It isn't as though the people who profit most from the system find it easy. On the other hand, you have to ask how efficacious has the resistance been? Well, it's slowed down various things. I mean, the fact is that India would have been incorporated into the capitalist world economy 100 years earlier if it didn't have the military power and so forth to resist. And it's only when the military power shifts and technology in the West advances that they can conquer India. So, sure, resistance matters. There was a French Revolution, there was a Russian Revolution, and you have to then say, well, look, let's look at they were major events. They really had substantial popular support before and after. They really affected people all over the world, and so forth. And yet one could argue, basically, we already have this argument way back with de Tocqueville, in which he says, writing about 1840, well, the French Revolution was really a blip because what you describe as changes are things that were a steady curve from the 17th century to the 19th century. You can make the same case with the Russian Revolution, that yes, they industrialized. This was carrying out the program of von Witte, and so forth, so forth. So it's a question of how important the resistance is. So the way I would put it is the following. When the system is functioning well, which is most of the time, resistance is like moving away from equilibrium. And the pressures to pull it back to equilibrium are very strong. So you put in a lot of effort and you move it just a little bit. However, when the system is in structural crisis, which is the present time, one of the features of structural crisis is wild fluctuations. And when you have wild fluctuations because you're already far from equilibrium, it turns out that moving a little bit moves the system a lot. So I call this the translation into analysis of the ancient debate between determinism and free will. When the system is functioning well, it's largely determinist, and resistance is a minor phenomenon. And when the system is functioning badly because it's in structural crisis, then we're into a period of free will in which resistance, or better put, the desire to move the system, when it's not to move the system, but to make sure that it bifurcates in this direction rather than in that direction, is greatly affected by agency, by people doing things. And we're living in that period. So I say to you, if you're, if you're politically activist, this is your moment. 50 years ago was not your moment. 50 years ago, you worked very hard and didn't get very far with it. In the next 20 to 50 years, you work very hard, you'll get very far with it. Okay? That's my take on resistance.
Good news, yeah?
I have a question on a different topic.
Okay.
You have written on social sciences, also university education as well. In late 1960s, anti-war movement protests started universities. But right now, U.S. government adopting many policies like preemptive strike, etc., etc. We had the Afghan war and then Iraq war. but there was no real resistance from universities. And there was a concept in America a few years ago was mentioned like embedded journalism, but right now it looks like there is an embedded academic studies. And where do you see university education is going?
Yes. Well, I think that's actually a wrong reading. First of all, you're primarily talking about the United States, of course. And I think it's a wrong reading. It is perfectly true that, how shall I say, the students are not occupying buildings the way they did in 1968. On the other hand, U.S. troops went into Vietnam shortly after 1956. They began to go in, and they kept increasing in number and importance. It wasn't until 1965 that we have the first teach-ins, and that was a small minority. It isn't really until 1968 that there is significant anti-war sentiment on the campuses, okay? And then when there is, at that point, for a whole series of reasons I could explain, it exploded in a way that it hasn't exploded. In this case, the anti-war resistance started immediately and is much more extensive than it was in the 1960s in terms of the numbers of people who feel that way. The estimate is that university professors in the United States have never in the history of modern U.S. been more likely to vote against the Republican Party than this year. That it's almost unanimous. You can hardly find a university professor who will support Bush. And that certainly wasn't true in 1968, where a large group of professors were strongly behind continuing U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. So that doesn't express itself, if you will, in the spectacular way of '68, but the sentiment is very, very strong there. And indeed, there's no question that if you took a referendum in the United States today, you'd get a bigger vote against the Iraq War than you would have gotten against the Vietnam War if you'd taken a referendum in '68. Now, that's not to speak of the rest of the world, where, I mean, you just have to look at what happened on February 15th, 2003, which the world never has had a greater single demonstration than the anti-war demonstration on that day. And the biggest demonstrations in percentage of population and in absolute numbers were in Great Britain, Spain, and Italy, the three countries in Europe that were most actively, whose governments were most actively supporting the United States. So I think there's a lot of resistance. Just tonight on television, I heard the first mumble by Rumsfeld of the possibility of withdrawing U.S. troops earlier than previously stated. I think the U.S. position has become relatively impossible in Iraq, and it's really a question of under what circumstance and how rapidly these troops will be withdrawn. They may not be withdrawn for 3, 4, 5 years, or they may be withdrawn within the next 6 months. That depends on a lot of things, but they will be withdrawn, and at the point that they're withdrawn, it will not be as a result of some military victory in Iraq. So I think there's quite a bit of resistance. I wouldn't understate it, but it hasn't caused anything like the revolution of 1968. I agree in terms of the form. On the other hand, again, let's talk about efficacy. I don't know.
There is a famous, website. It's called www.campuswatch.com, where Daniel Pipes and his fellows.
We had the same thing then. We had the same thing. It's perfectly true. Let me put it this way: the far right in the United States is better organized and more vicious than it was in the late 60s, but nonetheless, there were the same kind of efforts to smear people, and Campus Watch has not really affected anything. I mean, they're there, but there are very few places where they've been able to intimidate anybody. I wouldn't overstate their importance. They try, but it is, you know, again, it's not my reading of the U.S. at this moment. I don't think the war is popular. It's not that there are no supporters, but I think there are an awful lot of antis, and it's Bush's weakest read. There are more. If you ask questions on these polls, where he comes out weakest is that things are going well in Iraq, and there was a good idea to go into Iraq.
Yesterday, you mentioned about your forecast on the near future, and within your projections, you said that you are not hopeful for the future of a united Europe.
No, I didn't. No. I am actually hopeful.
No. So, let me say I am not so hopeful for the future of Europe.
That's different.
Can you make some comments on the, especially for the last 10 countries?
The last what?
Last 10 candidate countries, Poland,
yes,
Hungary,
okay,
etc., with their accession into the European Union. Will this cause a danger, a caution, a risk for the unification of Europe? Because there are many concerns on this. And the Central Europe, the core Europe, and Europe à la carte. And the same concerns is articulated for Turkey as well.
Well, it's perfectly true that the East European countries in the 90s had a different outlook on the world than the West European countries. They had all come out from under the Soviet yoke. They saw the world as one in which the Soviet Union and even its successor state, Russia, were their main threat to them. They saw the United States as a sort of savior, and so they were hostile to any links with Russia and hostile to any weakening of links with the United States. And this was certainly not the dominant attitude in Western Europe. And it was indeed one of the reasons why the U.S. pushed very hard for their inclusion in Europe. That said, I don't think it's going to last very long. Already today there's a public discussion in Poland as to whether they should withdraw troops from Iraq or not. The Minister of Defense said that we'll probably withdraw a third of our troops within a year, and somebody else said that's not government policy, and they're having a public fight in Poland about this issue. Public opinion has shifted in Poland, whereas it supported the war strongly a year ago. The majority are now hostile, and Poland was the country where the strongest support of the war in Eastern Europe always was. Furthermore, let's face it, the sentimental link with the U.S. is important, but the U.S. isn't going to do anything for these countries, and these countries' economic future lies with Western Europe. And investments, access, all those things they need from Western Europe. So objectively, they are going to be forced to move into the Western European mold, making a little difficulties en route, but I don't think that will last too long. And as the generation goes by, the people who remember how terrible the Soviet Union was die out, and the younger generations live with their immediate problems, and I think they will become much more European. Furthermore, they won't be able to get into the United States, and they will be able to migrate to Western Europe. All those things will change things. But it's slowed down Europe in some ways, but I think, in fact, the fiasco of Iraq is changing their vision. They how shall I say, latched on to Bush's vision of what the U.S. military might was. And as that vision gets undone by reality and people see that U.S. military power has its limits, this is affecting already public opinion in Western Europe and Eastern Europe, indeed everywhere in the world. No country has increased, well, it's not true, one country increased by 50 soldiers, but other than that, no country has increased the number of troops that they have sent to Iraq. A large number of countries have reduced or withdrawn entirely. The British are going to withdraw a third of their forces soon. So, I mean, there is this slow pulling away from what is basically turning out to be a failed policy. And that is going to re-energize European consolidation. Now, whether the British will actually go along with that or not, what we'll probably continue to have is a multiple set of Europes. We already have it, after all. There's the European Union, but there's the Euro, which is not everybody in the European Union, and there's Schengen, which is not everybody in the European Union, and so forth. It's a Europe at multiple speeds. We'll continue to have that for a while, but Europe as a cultural concept, as a political concept, as an independent force, seems to me will go very strong. Incidentally, it'll probably go strong economically also. So I think Europe, as I said yesterday, or was it the day before? Yes, I guess it was yesterday. Europe has two problems. One problem is Russia, and the other problem is Turkey. And they've got to figure out how they can create a working relationship with Russia. I think they're going to solve that problem, but that is a problem for them. And the second problem is Turkey, and that's a problem of whether Europe is ready to think of itself as a multicultural zone in which they can have a large number of Muslims within Europe and not find that a problem. And Europe hasn't made up its mind on that. And but if it doesn't, that will harm Europe more than it will harm Turkey. So anyway, I don't predict, however, that they will make this decision. It's a matter of great debate within Europe today. It's quite clear. The real political debate in terms of a popular level discussion.
My impression of your hopelessness based on those two problems.
It's not hopelessness. First of all, I think they're going to solve the Russia problem. I don't know if they'll solve the Turkey problem.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. It's too late, unfortunately. We are very glad to receive you here. And thanks to the audience. Good evening.
Thank you.